Thank you very much for allowing me to come today. And what I want to try to do today is a few different things. One of them, what I want to try to do is to, like I said, make sense a little bit about Minnesota and American politics today. But to do that, I'm going to need to take us back in time. And I'm going to eventually take us back in time to 50 years ago, to 1976, and set up a comparison, 1976 to today, to paint a picture to show the transformation of American and Minnesota politics. So I'm going to be doing that in tandem. So that's going to be the first thing, is to really sort of talk about this transformation that's been going on, I'd say, again, for a half a century. Then I want to bring it up to the present, give you some guesses or predictions about what's likely to happen in terms of the November elections this year. And then with that, if I don't forget, also giving us some sense of what that might mean no matter what after the 2026 elections. But as I start to talk, I want to take us back in time to 1998, because there's a reason why I want to do 1998 also too. And it's October of 1998, and some of you might recall that there was a guy named Jesse Ventura running for governor. And the reason why it's important is that I remember it's about the first or second week of October, can't remember exactly the right date at that point, and I get a call from a reporter at the Chicago Tribune who wants to do a story about Jesse Ventura. And he said, "Do you know much about Ventura?" And I said, "Not really." And he said, "Nobody else does either." And he said, "Let me ask you a bunch of questions." And he asked me a whole bunch of questions, but of course the only question of which he wanted an answer to was, is he going to win? Right. By pure coincidence, one of my friends at the time, Karen Louise Booth, who used to work at Minnesota Public Radio, they had just done a Mason-Dixon poll. And because I teach statistics and polling, Karen gave me the poll and said, "Can you read this for me, interpret it, so I can actually say something intelligent on the air about it?" And so about the first or second week of October 1998, remember approximately a month, maybe 3 weeks, a month before the election, what the polls were telling us were several different things. That Jesse Ventura had high name recognition, which means people knew who he was. He had high positives, which meant people liked him. He had low negatives, which means people didn't dislike him. And he was gaining in the polls. But he was only at about 17 to 18% in the poll at that point. His opponents, high name recognition, high negatives, low positives, and going down in the polls. My comment to the Chicago Tribune was, when asked the question, is he going to win, I said, he has a chance. I truly did not believe he was going to win. And, you know, he has a chance is a great weasel thing to say to anybody. Of course he wins. And the day after the election, I get a call from People magazine. Okay. People magazine calls me and says, "Congratulations, Professor Schultz. You were the only person in the country who successfully predicted that Jesse Ventura would win." When I reminded them and said to them, I didn't say he was going to win, he had a chance, they said, "Professor Schultz, you were closer than anybody else." And what I learned from that is you don't have to be right, you just have to be closer than anybody else. I may not be right in what I'm going to say today, but I think I'm going to get pretty close. This a little bit closer? Yep. Okay. I may not be right, but I think I can get pretty close to something to understanding American politics. Now, oftentimes when I give talks to groups like this over the last 3 to 4 to 5 years, there'll usually be at least 1 or 2 people who will come up to me, practically pulling the hair out of their head, exasperated, and will say something to the effect of, "Isn't this the most polarized we've ever been in American history?" And I'll first pause and I will say, the Civil War beat the heck out of this. Okay. I will then remind people and say that the 1960s was worse than this. That a president, his brother, 2 civil rights leaders were assassinated. The country was torn by a war, and we were hugely, hugely divided in lots of ways. And I say that in part because we somehow managed to figure out how to get our way out of those problems in the 60s. And by the time we get to the 1970s, especially now, 1976, we've managed to get beyond Watergate and Nixon. We got beyond the Vietnam War. We got beyond a lot of things that were really dominating and really dividing the country. And if we were to do some public opinion polling, roughly 1976, go out, at that time it would have been Harris, it would have been Gallup, it would have been National Opinion Research. These would have been the big polling institutions at that point. And we would have asked people a series of questions. Questions about the economy, about the Cold War, about social issues and so forth. Just a whole big range of issues. And if we were now to take all those responses and plot them on a graph, and the graph would now rank the responses from the most liberal to the most conservative, or most conservative to most liberal, depending on which direction you want to go, plot them out on the graph, you know what you would get? A bell curve. It would look exactly like this. And this is going to be incredibly important for lots of reasons. If you know anything about a bell curve is fat in the middle and tapers off at the ends here. And the reason why that is important is on a whole range of issues, most Americans would identify themselves as being in the center or centrists. American historians, I won't bore you with a lot of academic stuff today, if I can, hopefully not, but American historians would talk about what's called the consensus theory of American history. That throughout most of American history, there's been a broad consensus on a core set of values: liberty, equality, equality of opportunity, a whole bunch of different issues. But circa 1976, we would find that on a whole range of issues, again, war, peace, the economy, on so many different things, most Americans converged to the center. There were some who tailed off far left, some who tailed far off right, but the picture of what? Of convergence was actually there. Okay. Now, I do get to teach you a little bit of political science in the process today. All right. Now, take that bell curve. Everybody can imagine what it looks like. Excuse me, I'm sorry. And now draw a line right down the center. We're going to bisect it down the middle. Okay. What political scientists would call that center is what's called the median voter. Half the voters would be to the left, half the voters would be to the right. Okay. This is really significant, this median voter, because I now want to invoke one of my heroes. Okay. Okay. Now I know Tim is with Blaze, and so he's going to probably wonder why I have such a hero like this one. But Willie Sutton is one of my heroes. Okay. Willie Sutton is a famous bank robber. Okay, or was. When asked the question once, now Tim sees why I'm mentioning here. When asked the question of Willie Sutton once, why do you rob banks? He said, because that's where all the money is. And if you think about it, the logic makes an incredible amount of sense, is that go where the money is. So now, when I draw this in my class, and I draw this bell curve in my class, I bisect it with the median voter, I ask them a question that I'll ask you rhetorically, but you might want to still answer it anyhow. If you were the two major political parties, Republican and Democrat, and you knew that the majority of voters were located in the center, if you wanted to nominate a candidate to run for president who you think was likely to win, would you nominate a candidate going to the far left or to the far right, or would you pick somebody closer to the center? Now, all of you employing the Willie Sutton logic would say, I would pick somebody close to the center, which makes an incredible amount of sense. And for those of you who either were around, or more likely for many of you just reading your history books, would know in 1976 there was a presidential election. And the nominees for the two parties were Jimmy Carter as Gerald Ford. And you could basically describe Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford as ideologically not being that far apart. That if we look at the median voter, Jimmy Carter was probably maybe just a hair to the left, or maybe dead center to the median voter. Gerald Ford was probably the same thing, just maybe a hair to the right, but pretty close to the center. And that explains why, for example, that was also one of the closest presidential elections in American history, because many people argued that had that election gone 2 more weeks, Gerald Ford would have won the election as opposed to Jimmy Carter, because Gerald Ford was overcoming sort of the taint of Watergate, that he had pardoned Nixon and so forth like that. But it was an incredibly close election as it was. All right. Now, some other pictures I want to give you at the national level in terms of American politics. Okay. Still, we're operating with that bell-shaped curve. We still have the median voter. The next thing that we would want to know is that the center for the two major political parties, Republicans and Democrats, would not have been very far from that median voter. So on my bell curve, which looks like this, and by the way, I didn't ask for a PowerPoint because I can bore people without one. And I also say that, guess what? Imagination is more powerful than actual description. Because as I'm going like this several times, you all see the bell curve in your brain, don't you? And you see the median line go right down the center. But now, the center for the two major parties are not far from that overall center. So in my bell curve, bisected like this, the Republican here, the Democrat are here. The center of the two parties are not very far apart from one another, and they're not very far apart from what? The median voter. Right. With that, again, I still get to teach you some more political science in the process here. Is that what we would have described American political parties as in 1976 is what we would call coalitional parties. And the reason why that's important is that the Democratic and Republican parties had moderates, liberals, and conservatives in both parties. So for the Democrats, for example, you would have had a Ted Kennedy liberal. You would have had, I'm trying to think, maybe I would have classified Jimmy Carter as kind of a centrist, and then I make no apologies in saying that there were probably at that point, in fact, not probably, they were, in the Democratic Party, Southern white racists who were part of the Democratic Party. No question about it. In the Republican Party, you would have had an interesting mixture also, too. You would have had, on the Republican side, and I'll bring it close to home here, you would have had David Durenberger. David Durenberger, who would have described himself in his wonderful book from a few years ago, a book called When Republicans Were Progressives. He was a liberal Republican. You would have had more centrists like a Mark Hatfield, and then you would have had a little bit more conservative in terms of somebody like a Ronald Reagan, and then you would have had clearly very, very conservative in terms of Barry Goldwater. These were parties that were ideologically mixed. And this is going to be important for understanding a lot of different things that are out there, is that the parties were not monolithic. And if you're thinking about trying to work across the aisles, you could always find people in the opposite party who might have been of a different party, but ideologically agreed with you in some important ways. And again, David Durenberger, who became a friend of mine for a variety of reasons, always used to say that he could always find a Democrat who agreed with him on something. It's important. Okay. Now, another way of describing it, some of you know I'm from New York. I'm doing kind of my autobiography in the process here too, is just to paint another picture of the story here in a different way, is that when I was growing up, my governor was a Republican, Nelson Rockefeller. My first U.S. Senator was a Republican, Jacob Javits. My second U.S. Senator was Bobby Kennedy, a Democrat. You know who was the most liberal of the three? No question about it, Jacob Javits. You know who the most conservative of the three was? No question about it, Bobby Kennedy. That shows you something about shifts in the party over time that we're eventually going to get to here. So the second characteristic would have been what? From 1976, the bell curve, the median, the centers of the two parties close to one another, and the two parties were what? Ideologically diverse. A third characteristic of American politics, eventually I will bring you down to Minnesota in a few minutes here. A third characteristic is that if we look at the U.S. House of Representatives, okay, 435 members, and in the House of Representatives back then, we could point to the fact that about 120, roughly 1/3 of the U.S. House of Representatives came from what we call swing districts. And what I mean by that, about 2/3 of the districts, we could easily predict if they were going to elect a Democrat or a Republican for all kinds of reasons, okay? Because what? Maybe it's 60% Democrats or 60% Republicans here, et cetera, et cetera. But these 120 swing seats were just about evenly balanced with, let's say, maybe roughly 40% Democrat, 40% Republican, or 45-45, about 10% independent or something like that. They were a perfect model of the bell curve at the congressional level. For those of you who want some kind of a local comparison here, if anybody remembers Jim Ramstad. Jim Ramstad, that was, out in the western suburbs, kind of a modern version of that. Or right now, Angie Craig's 2nd Congressional District, same thing, kind of a centrist seat at this point. And the reason why these swing districts were important is that they were drivers of political compromise. Neither the Republicans nor the Democrats alone on straight party line votes could move their agenda. They needed to have these members from the swings. And think about it from a logical point of view now too. If your district is pretty centrist, and if you start veering too far to the left or too far to the right, what's likely to happen to you in the next election? You're looking for a job afterwards. And so these individuals had powerful incentives to play it in the center, but they also were the people who drove the political compromises and for the negotiation. Okay. The final characteristic, I think for now, of looking at American politics in 1976 was to look at voters. Back then, approximately 10 to 15% of the voters were what we would call swing voters. And what we mean by that, they might vote for a Democrat for president, vote for a Republican for governor, and maybe split ticket all the way down to dog catcher. Now, I do use the word dog catcher. I say that because I have family in Vermont, and up until 2 years ago, dog catcher was an elected position. I always wanted to move to Vermont so I could run for dog catcher so I could figure out what my campaign platform would be or something like that. So on one level, swing voters, 10 to 15% were split ticket voters. Or conversely, what they might do is vote Republican one election, Democrat in another, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the pattern. All right. So think about this now. Think about the characteristics of 1976 nationally. The bell curve, the median voter, the centers of the two parties close to one another. What you had is about 1/3 of the Congress came from swing districts, and you had 10 to 15% of the voters who were what? Swing. At the Minnesota level, 134 House members. We could roughly go back to 1975, 1976, and also see at about approximately 40 came from swing districts. In the Senate, which is 67, we would have found somewhere around 15 to 20 that came from swing districts. What we would also know, we would know nationally, are some fascinating things. What those fascinating things would be is if we actually looked at voting records in Congress, the vast majority of the votes were bipartisan. Sure, there were some things straight party line, such as picking the Speaker of the House, but if you looked at some of the most critical things that happened, 1974, 75, 76 in that area, these were powerful bipartisan votes. For example, right before here today, I know some people were worried, like, where is Schultz? My guest, Elaine, is like, where is David today? I was giving another talk this morning, right before this one, so we were running a little bit late here. But if we start to think about some of the major things that happened post-Watergate, we were concerned in Congress about the president having too much power. So bipartisanly, they passed the War Powers Act to trim back on presidential power to commit troops. Concerned about the fact that Nixon had abused campaign finances, passed major campaign finance reform. Concerned about the fact that the president was refusing to spend certain money allocated by Congress, passed the 1974 Budget Impoundment Act, and concerned about the fact that the president was basically willy-nilly declaring national emergencies, passed the National Emergencies Act, NEA. All of this was done bipartisan, and in some situations, with numbers so large, they were able to override presidential vetoes. I mean, this is pretty significant in terms of it. Another way to capture this, in 1974, when the House Judiciary Committee voted to impeach Richard Nixon and make the recommendation to the entire House, it was a bipartisan vote. Additionally, for any of you, who, either in the history books who watched it, when the Senate Judiciary Committee was holding hearings into Watergate. It was a Republican Senator, Howard Baker, who coined the phrase, "What did the president know and when did he know it?" And then I saw this clip recently. Again, I had forgotten about it. In St. Paul, at least, they were running a television station called Decades. Did anybody catch it for the last couple of years, something like that? It was running for a while, but they were showing clips from old shows from like the 60s and 70s. And it wasn't David Frost. It was one of the other talk show commentators. I can't remember which one it was at this point now. And it's this great scene where they're in the Senate office chambers. He's interviewing the talk show host, Howard Baker. And again, he's practically apoplectic, worried about what Nixon's doing. It's 1974. And he's saying things like, Nixon's going to get away with it. Nixon's dirty. He's going to get away with it. Howard Baker turns to him, pats him on the shoulder, and says, "Don't worry, we're going to get Nixon." That's a great story, isn't it? And remember, it was Barry Goldwater, the most conservative Republican in the Senate, when after the House Judiciary votes to impeach, before it goes to the entire House for impeachment, Barry Goldwater goes to Nixon and says, "You better step down now because you don't have the votes to save you." Isn't that an amazing picture of American politics? It really is. We could also, just to add to it here, again, imagine I were doing Venn diagrams, say, with circles. I could take the votes of the average member of a Democrat in Congress and Republican, and they would overlap. That would be our picture of what happened. That's American politics. That's Minnesota politics. All right. So now, a variety of ways of telling us about the transformation. All right. This year is interesting for me. This is 40 years ago, this August, is when I left New York to come out here to go to school at the University of Minnesota. And with the exception of several years of teaching in Texas, I've been here more or less ever since. But I tell people that when I moved here in 1986, a pro-life Democrat, Rudy Perpich, won election. 4 years later, defeated by a pro-choice Republican, Arnie Carlson. What do you think the chances are right now that the Democrats would ever nominate a pro-life candidate or the Republicans a pro-choice candidate to head up their ticket anywhere? If you were to say something like a snowball's chance in hell, you're probably right at this point. It's not going to happen. Or yet another way of telling the story. It's October. It's 2008. I'm also faculty at the University of St. Thomas Law School. And I was asked to give a talk about the election. Senator David Durenberger, no longer senator at this point, is also faculty, I think, somewhere at St. Thomas. David and I became friends when I was the executive director of Common Cause Minnesota. And he was actually very, very good in supporting lots of campaign finance reform, government kind of reform projects like that. And so Senator Durenberger, October of 2008, sends me an email and says, "I hear you're going to give a talk. Do you mind if I come over and go listen?" I said, "Sure, if you want to waste an hour, why not? Sure, come over," like that. So he shows up. It's late afternoon, and there's a reception line. We've got like the cookies and snacks and stuff like that. And so Senator Durenberger's hanging out behind me, and he turns to me and he goes, "I don't know if I should get my snacks here or at the next reception that I'm going to go to." And I said, "So where's the next reception you're going to?" And he said, "I'm going to a Barack Obama fundraiser." And I looked at him and I said, cleaning up my language, and I'll clean up his language too. I said, "What the heck are you doing going to a Barack Obama fundraiser? He's a Democrat, you're a Republican." And he barks back and he says, "There's no place in the Republican Party for me anymore." And he said, "There's no place for people like Arnie Carlson in the Republican Party anymore. I feel like I've been totally orphaned." I tell these stories because they tell us something about the transformation that's happened in American politics. Now, if I were actually doing a PowerPoint or doing slides, I would show a series of slides that would show that bell curve that gradually breaks down over a 50-year period and collapses. And there are several ways that I can capture that breakdown. The simplest one would be to say, imagine the bell curve was sitting down there on the floor, and I took my foot and stepped on the center. The center would go down, and the two sides would pop out like that. Picture number one. Picture number two, American politics has become a doubles hump camel's back. The most technical way of describing it, it's a bimodal curve. It goes up like this, comes down like this, goes up like that. The Economist actually has great graphics in terms of showing the breakdown of that bell-shaped curve to the bimodal over about a 30-year period. But what we literally live in now is a bimodal curve. And what I mean by that, if we were now to go out and do survey research on the American public, and again on Minnesota, because they dovetail, what we would find by looking at surveys such as, for example, National Opinion Research Center, we would look at Gallup, we would look at, among the best, I think, is the Pew Research Center, which is, I'll do my bias here. I say it's absolutely phenomenal because the people who head it up are my former teachers at Rutgers. They're among the best pollsters in the country, which they truly are, by the way. And what we would find is that, at least on one level, fewer Americans identify in the center than before. Now, I said on one level, I'll qualify that again later on here, is that what has happened over time is that more and more Americans are identifying as further to the right and further to the left than it used to be. Yes, about 30% of Americans, when asked in survey research, when asked in exit polls, say they're independent. But by the time we really look at how people really do vote, there's very few who are not leaning one way or another. The patterns are pretty clear. At some point, I'll show you how clear the patterns are in a few minutes here. So, as I like to tell people, nationwide, we live no longer in what? A bell-shaped curve society. We live in a bimodal curve society, of which the implications are significant in terms of what it means. Okay, so now I get to invoke Willie Sutton yet again. I still think he's a genius. If fewer voters are in the center than before, and more are to the left or to the right, would you, as a major political party, nominate a candidate to the center? It would make no sense whatsoever to do that. Because what? Picking somebody who's in the center, you're going to miss most of the voters. What has happened over time is that parties now nominate candidates to the center of their parties, not to the center of American politics. And what we know over time, still, we can do that bimodal curve. I can still bisect it down the middle with the median voter. But the median voter is meaningless now. Truly is meaningless. Okay. But what we can also look at is how the centers of the two major parties have gotten further and further apart over time. And I'm going to give you some great numbers in a few minutes here in Minnesota about that distance also, on some work I did recently. So the centers of the two parties are getting further and further apart from one another. And what has happened is that the nature of American political parties has changed. We're no longer coalitional parties. We are what? Ideological parties. So if I were to turn to, turn to any of you over there, and we were to have a discussion about, let's say, British politics, and I were to say to you, do you realize that most of the people in the Conservative Party in England are conservative? You would look at me and say, that's not a very insightful thing to say. Or if I were to say most of the people in the Labour Party in England are to the left, you would say, I kind of expected that. Okay. And that's very typical. European-style parties are much more ideological. That has never been our history. But guess what? That's where we are now. We have European-style political parties that have become very, very heavily disciplined ideologically. I'm going to argue all the way from top down to the bottom. So now we've got the center of the parties moving further and further apart, where the parties are now what? Have ideologically sorted themselves out. We're going to do more sorting in a few minutes here. Okay. Still stay with that picture. We also want to think about those 120 swing seats. Those 120 swing seats which existed in 1976, we're down now to maybe 30 to 40 seats in Congress that are at best in play. For this November, the best estimates are that what? 30, 35 seats are truly in play. The rest of them are safely Republican, safely Democrat. And remember, just to remind you here, we elect all 435 seats in House every 2 years, so they're all in play. In the Senate, we only elect 33 every 2 years. The best estimate is what? Maybe 7 seats in the Senate are in play. Keep in mind again that this is the closest the U.S. House of Representatives has been in terms of party divide since the late 1930s. It is razor, razor thin. The Senate is razor thin also in terms of how close it is. If I were to even get more grisly statistics here, I could point out how 2 years ago, how in the House of Representatives and for the Senate, if you shifted just a few, I think it's 10,000 votes in 3 House races in the United States, the Democrats have control of the House of Representatives. Democrats actually received more votes for the U.S. Senate 2 years ago than Republicans did, but Republicans control the Senate. This is just to underscore what? How truly, truly close, how truly divided it is. Moreover, if we look at those 120 collapsing to 30 or 40 seats, that means what? Those swing seats, which are the drivers of political compromise, are disappearing away. Straight party line votes now can just about decide what's going to happen. You don't need to compromise. Now, we also can look at the swing voters. Remember I said it was 10 to 15% that were swing voters? Now the best evidence suggests between 0 and 5% of all the voters are swing. You're like, what do you mean by that, Schultz? Well, the best predictor of whether you're going to vote, are you a Democrat or Republican? The best predictor of how you're going to vote, are you a Democrat or Republican? What we have found over time is that swing voters have largely disappeared. And what it means to be a swing voter has changed. It's no longer split ticket voting, but it's about what? Do I swing in and show up to vote, or do I swing out and decide I don't want to vote at this point? Politics has shifted into what? Mobilizing bases, demobilizing the other base, and hoping that if the few swing voters that are out there don't vote for you, you hope they at least just don't vote, please, or something like that. And if we think about who the most critical swing voters are, still at the top of the list, college-educated suburban women. 2, people under the age of 30. 3, people of color. If they show up to vote, Democrats do well. If they stay home, Republicans do well. I want to just talk about college-educated suburban women for a second because this is the most fascinating group. 25 to 30 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, they were hardcore Republican voters. Think of somebody like Judy Dutcher. If anybody remembers her, I know you remember her. Judy Dutcher was a Republican who eventually becomes a Democrat. A lot of Republican women in her category move away from the Democratic Party because of what? Reproductive rights issues, gun issues, education, and so forth like that. They're not completely sold on the Democrats because the Democrats don't consistently talk about the issues that they believe in either, but they're not enamored by the Republicans. The same thing with people of color, the same thing with people under the age of 30. If any of you come to Hamlin, which I know is a liberal bubble, and it is, but listen to my students. My students who might lean Democrat, for the most part, think that most of the Democrats really don't care about young people. And the reality is for them, it looks like it doesn't, because I could talk about this later, is that the things that affect them the most, cost of college, cost of housing, cost of health care, and the environment, largely both parties are blowing off at this point. So for a variety of reasons, we've got these groups of swing voters who are in play. Will they swing in and swing out? That's what American politics is right now. So think about it now. American politics, It's the bimodal curve. It is the center of the two parties moving further and further apart from one another. It is the roughly 30 to 40 swing seats, 0 to 5% swing voters. I should also add to this something else, is that if within the party somebody were to say, let's go compromise, let's no negotiate, more likely than not, that person's going to get what? Primaried from the left or primaried from the right, and they're not going to have a job. Okay. What does this mean nationally? What it means is that several things. First, the vast majority of votes in Congress now for the last few years are straight party line votes. Almost never do you see bipartisan votes. Second, unless you subscribe to the idea that government that governs the least governs the best, this, for the last, let's say, decade, has been among the least productive Congresses in American history in terms of the amount of legislation. They're just not passing anything. It rivals where Congress was in the 1940s, in the middle of World War II, where for all kinds of reasons, Congress was preoccupied, with other things, probably in good reasons for doing that. If we were to look at the voting in Congress right now, the most liberal voting Republican votes more conservatively than the most conservative Democrat. To go back to my Venn diagrams, it's not this anymore, it's this. Okay. State of Minnesota, we've got roughly the same thing. This year, unless Mary Jo disagrees with me, and I know she follows it closely here, in the 134 House seats in Minnesota, even though there are like 43 people not running for re-election this year, at best, 12 or so of the House seats are in play. That would be pushing it. Yeah, about right. Yeah, probably about. At best, of the 67 Senate seats, most people are saying 6 or 7 are in play. The control of the House, the control of the Senate is going to come down to what? An infinitesimally few number of seats, of which they're going to absorb the lion's share of the money for campaigns and elections at this point. And again, just to underscore how close Minnesota is, right now, we are again one of the few states in the country with a split legislature. Yes, we did have a trifecta here, but at one point, we were one of only, I think it was at one point, one of less than 10 states in the country that had a split control of the legislature. Most states in the country, I think it's 38 or 39 in the country, it's a trifecta. Both chambers plus the governor's office are of one party. We have had the most volatility in terms of shift of party control in the legislature of any state in the country over the last, let's say, 10 to 15 years. Again, go back 2 years ago. Move approximately, remember we're 67 right now in the House. Move approximately 3,000 votes in 3 House races in Minnesota, and the Republicans would have won it. Move approximately 5,000 votes, I think it was in 2 Senate seats in Minnesota, the Republicans have control. That's how close we are, how tight we are. We are nearly a perfect microcosm of the divide in American politics at this point. So we are a wonderful, or not so wonderful, living laboratory of what's happening in terms of what's going on across the country. Now, I want to add even more to my picture here about division. Many of you know I'm on Almanac a lot. I've been doing it for probably over 20 years or so. And there used to be a person on Almanac with me, Stacy Hunter Hecht, who taught at Bethel College. Stacy was a very dear friend of mine who unfortunately at age 47 passed away from breast cancer. I loved her dearly as a colleague and as a friend. But it was about 3 years before the 2016 presidential election. We're hanging out in the green room at Almanac. And she turns to me and she says, "You, of course, know that the presidential election is over in 40 states." And I said, "Yeah, of course it is." I said, "Because of the Electoral College, because of the spatial distribution of Democrats and Republicans, we know exactly what's going to happen in California, New York, Texas, and so forth like that. It's going to come down to what? 10 states. We also knew within those 10 states, it was only going to come down to what? About 10% of the voters. So we did a book, and we made sure It came out, this is actually great, it came out 2 weeks before she passed away because she wanted to be able to pass it on to her daughter to basically say, here's what I'm doing here. We basically did an argument that said that the presidential election was going to come down to 10% of the swing voters in 10 states that would determine the election. Our guess was it was going to come down to what? No more than about 200,000 voters. We were a little off on it, but pretty close. Okay. But just to give you an idea how closely divided this country is on the picture of polarization. In 2016, had Hillary Clinton picked up 43,000 more votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, she's president of the United States. Had Donald Trump, picked 90,000 votes. Okay, had Donald Trump in 2020 picked up 43,000 more votes in Arizona, Georgia, and Wisconsin, he's president. Had Harris 2 years ago picked up 220,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, she's president of the United States. We are literally down to what? Barely 250,000 people determining the presidency. To make it even better, just to give you different pictures of how close it is here. Okay. Scranton, Pennsylvania is located in Lackawanna County. Hillary Clinton's family is from Lackawanna County, Scranton. Joe Biden's family is from there. More importantly, my mother's family is from there. I spent part of my life in Lackawanna County, Scranton, Pennsylvania. For anybody who wants a comparison, it's a little bit like the Iron Range, but it was coal mining, not taconite. I know Lackawanna County exceedingly well. I still have family there. I mention this because Lackawanna County historically would vote pro-union Democrat overwhelming, much like the Iron Range would do here when the Democratic Party was still Democratic Farmer and Labor, of which now what? The Farmer and Labor has left. I made an argument in 2016 in the Philadelphia Inquirer that if Donald Trump either won Lackawanna County or got close, he would win Pennsylvania. If he won Pennsylvania, he would win the presidency. He got razor-thin close of winning Lackawanna County, of which then he won Pennsylvania, of which then he won the Electoral College. 2020, Joe Biden wins a blowout in Lackawanna County, wins Pennsylvania, wins the presidency. Donald Trump, 2 years ago, wins Lackawanna County, et cetera, et cetera. If I really wanted to make an argument, and this is the piece I did in the Philadelphia Inquirer, I said, as Scranton goes, so goes the country. One county is an incredibly powerful predictor. Doesn't this give you an amazing picture of how closely divided we are in this country, where it's just an incredible small number of votes? Okay, now, I'm going to go for about 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to open up for questions here. Okay, I want to give you another picture of our divides. At least 2 other quick pictures here. Okay, we're not just divided by party. Democrats and Republicans have sorted themselves out in lots of ways. Geographically, Democrats and Republicans like to live in different neighborhoods. For example, I live in the Summit Hill neighborhood of St. Paul, Minnesota. Overwhelmingly Democratic. One of my neighbors a few years ago turned to me, he was a Republican, and he said, any chance a Republican's ever going to win here? And I said, no. He said, okay. He moved to Eden Prairie. We know this is true, the geographic sorting out. We also know it is true that besides what the proverbial Republicans watch Fox, Democrats watch CNN or MS Now, it gets even better. Marketing data and consumer preferences overlay with geography and party. I'll do the easy ones first. You tell me you drive a Subaru, I know exactly how you vote. You tell me you go shop at Gander Mountain, I know how you vote. Okay. Now you tell me you drive your Subaru to Gander Mountain, then I'm confused. Okay. But taking 2024 election data at the county level and correlating it with consumer preferences, I'm not going to tell you the answers, but you can guess. tofu versus pork rinds, gravy versus pesto, Velveeta versus brie, NASCAR versus NPR, biscuits and gravy, Spam versus prosciutto, Miracle Whip versus mayonnaise, Whole Foods, Lululemon versus what? Versus Chick-fil-A. There are clear patterns that are out there. You tell me where you shop, the clothes that you wear. I'm not going to stare too close, and I'm not going to look at your cars when I go home. I can make nearly perfect predictions on how you're going to vote at this point. And this is what campaigns do if they have lots of money. They combine all this stuff. Okay, my last thing I want to talk about here. 2 weeks ago, I think it was 2 weeks ago this weekend, 2 weeks ago past weekend, or 2 weekends ago, the Republican and Democratic parties in Minnesota had their conventions, neither of which I would say went very well. We've got, on the Republican side, significant challenges that are going to happen in primaries, and the same thing within the Democratic Party also, too. I decided it would be kind of interesting is to look at the party platforms for the Democratic and Republican parties, what they say about a whole range of issues, and then look at public opinion polling in Minnesota. KSTP, Survey USA polling, Star Tribune, NPR, I think Carol 11 do their polls. I used 12 different issues and created a composite of where the median voter was in Minnesota. Scaled it on a 0 to 100. 0 being very, very conservative, 100 being very, very liberal. Minnesotans come out as a 60. The average Minnesota voter, again, average, kind of a composite here, pro-choice, but not pro-choice across the board, a little queasy in some situations on some abortion issues. Generally supports the social welfare state, LGBTQ issues, has some concerns in terms of how money's being spent and about fraud. Okay, I can run through a whole bunch of other issues here, but 60 is where most Minnesotans are. Employing the Willie Sutton logic again. Okay. The Democratic platform comes in at an 80, the Republican Party comes in at a 23. The gap between them is absolutely enormous, between Republicans and Democrats. That's huge. It's like 60 points. But also think about what this means for politics. The Republicans haven't won statewide office in what, 20 years? Well, if you are that far out from where the average voter is, your chances of winning a statewide election are not very good. For the Democrats, they're closer, but they're still further to the left than the average voter at this point. And what? They benefit from what? Well, heck, I don't know how to vote. A voter might say, I'm closer to the Democrats than I am to the Republicans, but guess what? I don't really like either of them at this point. Doesn't that also tell us something about what? The polarization at the legislature and a whole bunch of different things. Okay, let me stop there. I've got about 8 or 9 minutes, and how about, let's see, who's my MC for today? Okay, you get to call on the people. That way I don't make the choice. All right. Okay.
I just have to say, first of all,
Loud.
all right, hi, David, thank you so much, Mary Jo McGuire. I am so grateful for all of your commentary. So grateful for all of your commentary through all the years that you've provided that for this state and this country. So thank you, and I could listen to you all day because I have just a lot of questions. You've answered part of it, which was about these last conventions that we just saw. But I'm curious about, we talk a lot about polling, and how are we getting people's sense of things? Because people don't answer their phones, they don't answer their doors. It's really hard to get a sense of where people are at. So I'm wondering how campaigns and pollsters are getting people's sense of things.
Okay, so that's actually, okay, I should probably have that back for a guess. Okay. That's actually a really good question here. Okay, so a couple of different things here. Again, and it actually is pertinent now. When I mentioned the fact that pertinent about what I was mentioning about the Pew Research Center, when I mentioned the fact that 2 of my former professors, who I had at Rutgers when I did my master's, head up Pew. And Pew's very, very good. So I've spent a lot of time talking to them in terms of it. And they acknowledge a lot of these problems that you're bringing up here. But they also point out the fact that that there are some ways of correcting for this, but also if you're willing to spend the money, you can actually create good polls. I mean, David Beal, some of you might have remembered him. David Beal used to be the business writer for the Pioneer Press for years. David and I did a really good piece a few years ago. Well, he did, and I sort of threw my name on it too. I mean, because he's a great writer. He's a great writer. And we interviewed like Star Tribune, lots of different groups like that. And what we found out, this is like circa 8 or 9 years ago, is to do a decent poll in, let's say in Minnesota, you're going to have to spend about $80,000 or $90,000 to be able to do it. Newspapers, as we've started to see now with the Star Tribune now, are on the chopping block, and we already noticed with the Pioneer Press, they don't want to spend this kind of money. So they do it on the cheap. I mean, look at the polls. They're doing what, 400, 500 people or something like that. You can't do it. But if you actually are willing to spend the money, the cost is huge, because in the old days, you would get about 1 out of 3 people who you could contact. Now it's about 1 out of 30. So some of the really good polling still does do this in terms of it. But you're right. They're a little bit more complicated here in terms of doing polling. But I will say the piece that I did, and it appeared, actually, KSTP did a story about this the other night, about the study I did about how far the parties are apart. So the good story is there, is that originally I had only looked at the KARE 11 NPR polling data, but when then I eventually brought in the KSTP Survey USA, guess what? Same results. So the other way that you do it, what? You triangulate. You do several different polls, bring it together, and see if we can triangulate it. So I'm actually one of these. Now, Steve Shearer used to teach at Carleton, and Steve and I are good friends here. Steve's more skeptical of polling than I am. I'm not quite as skeptical, especially if you do multiple polls and triangulate.
I think I saw Lynn next, and then I'll come back here.
Hi, I echo Mary Jo. Thank you so much.
Sure.
I feel like we have a gem in you.
Thank you.
And I do a lot of national work, and people talk about you nationally, about the good stuff. I am very concerned that both our national and state level, our leadership is leading our way. I don't feel like elected officials have a voice. Hence, as a constituent, I feel I do not have a voice.
Okay, so we're obviously moving beyond the realm of political scientists here now. Okay, a little bit here. James McGregor Burns is an amazing historian who wrote a lot of work all about leadership over time, and I love his work. And I still remember one of his definitions of leadership is leadership is authority guided by Leadership is authority guided by ethical values. And I always like that definition. And I say this for a couple of reasons. First, when you started off by saying you're concerned about leadership, I'm not seeing a lot of leadership in our society right now, right off the bat. Is that leadership is the willingness to make tough choices. It's the willingness to be able to say to somebody, I know this is what you want, but we really need to do this. Who is it? Some of you know Tom Horner. Tom Horner's a friend of mine, and Tom Horner calls it the eat your vegetables approach to being in government, that at some point you just tell people you have to eat your vegetables or something like that. And I'm serious, by the way. So I think that's part of the issue here, is that there is this incredible dearth of leadership that's out there right now. How do you get that back? I don't know. I truly wish I knew how to do that. But I also think this is where I get to bring in things like the social media. I get to bring in my story about Jimmy Carter now, too, who I still think Jimmy Carter's speech to the American public when he was president, people call it the crisis of the American Republic speech, was right, where he basically said at one point, the problem in America is rooted in part with Americans also. And I think he was fundamentally correct, and we rewarded him by throwing him out of office. But what I'm getting at here is that to a large extent, the social media is creating a situation where, in part, leaders feel like they have to capitulate to what? The extreme voices, which are the loud voices that are out there. The rules of our political system. And this is the point that I was trying to make about our conventions right now, is that we know that people who show up at conventions are more extreme on the left and right than the general public is at this point. We are only one of 9 states in the United States that use nominating conventions at this point. 20 years ago, I made this argument that the problem is that we go from and I actually talked about it when Tim was still with Carol Levin. We talked about it on the show once at one point here. Whoops, I'm sorry. Okay, we talked about this where only about 2.5% of Minnesotans show up at the caucuses. That's already an incredibly rarefied population. By the time we get down to the conventions and run through the gauntlet of the convention process, which is multi-layers, what do you really have is what? The extreme of the extreme at this point. And so the rules, the process is set up, at least in Minnesota and nationwide, that it rewards extreme voices that are also amplified in the social media, of which then what? The leaders either listen to their extreme voices or they're the product of those extreme voices. I've been talking about in the last couple of years, and I'm stealing a line. Back in the 90s, I was the executive director for Common Cause Minnesota, and on the 25th anniversary of the Saturday Night Massacre, I had the privilege of bringing Archibald Cox to Minnesota, who was the special prosecutor fired by him, and I had dinner with Archibald Cox. He gave an amazing speech of which he gave me the privilege of stealing a line of his. And he was talking about the role of money in politics, and he said, the rules that determine who gets to give money in politics are the rules that determine the rules of the game. And I always thought that was brilliant. And so I add this to it. American politics is a board game. There's a set of rules. The rules determine how the game is played. The game is being played by what? Big money. The game is being played by the social media. The game is being played by a set of rules that favor extremist voices. Unless we can figure out some kind of ways of changing those rules, we're not going to change the game. Now, does that mean the leadership has to come first or whatever? There's a cart versus a horse issue here. I don't know how to solve it. But that's sort of how I view it at this point.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to do any more questions today. Let's give a round of applause.
Thank you.
On behalf of the office,
Thank you.
present you with our promise.
Oh, good.